My name is Emilia Quade, and on the night of my niece's engagement party, my sister lifted a glass, smiled at the crowd of relatives and friends, and thanked nearly every woman in the room by name, except me. The party was held in a private room at the Charleston Harborside Club, overlooking the marina where the city's wealthiest lined their boats up like trophies. The room was candlelit and curated down to the monogrammed cocktail napkins. It was the kind of place where people wore pearls without irony and used phrases like legacy seating for family members closest to the champagne fountain. I wasn't seated anywhere near it. My invitation had arrived a week late, folded in with a birthday card I suspected was regifted. The envelope wasn't even sealed. I still showed up. Not to be seen. Certainly not to be celebrated. But because someone else was coming that night, someone who had walked through foreign embassies under security escort and addressed conflict panels on behalf of the United Nations. Someone who had read my name in rooms where my family didn't even know I existed. And when that person walked in, the entire room would stop. And they would realize that the woman my sister had so carefully excluded was the only one at that party whose name mattered outside of holiday cards. But at the beginning of the evening, none of that had happened yet. At the start, I was just the woman in the black sheath dress, seated at the farthest edge of the room, next to a water station where interns from the event staff kept refilling pitchers and ignoring me. I wasn't surprised. This was the role I'd been cast in long ago. My sister, Madeline, was always the polished one, the social architect. She could throw together a baby shower in 24 hours with themed cupcakes and custom hashtags. She sent newsletters with family updates. She remembered birthdays. Or at least, she had someone remember them for her. I was the quiet one, the unmarried one, the one who moved to DC for some admin job and never really came back. No one ever asked what that admin job turned into. No one noticed that I hadn't just left. I'd chosen silence over spectacle. And tonight, they assumed I was there out of guilt or obligation. They assumed wrong. When I arrived, a young man at the entrance glanced at my name and blinked. "Oh, I think you're table 6, maybe table 7? He checked a crumpled printout. "Actually, can you just grab a seat wherever there's space?" There wasn't any space near the center, or near the fire pit where the groom's parents were holding court with flutes of Prosecco and cautious smiles. I ended up in the corner, at what I silently called the exile table, flanked by a cousin no one really talks to after his third marriage and a woman who kept referring to me as Eleanor, despite the name tag. Madeline floated past once, perfumed and poised. She waved vaguely, the kind of wave you give to someone who might have been a high school teacher you're trying to politely forget. The slideshow of Emilia, my niece, her daughter, played on a loop behind the bar. Photos of her at cheer competitions, honor roll banquets, on college move-in day. There was one photo of her as a toddler, seated on a checkered blanket in Rock Creek Park. I was the one who took that picture. No one knew that. I didn't ask to be thanked. I didn't expect to be acknowledged. But when Madeline stood to toast her daughter's brilliant future and began naming the women who'd shaped Emilia's world, it wasn't just an oversight. She mentioned the elementary school art teacher who once lived next door, the aunt who sent her bracelets from a gift shop in Naples, even her own Pilates instructor. She skipped right over me like I wasn't sitting 20 feet away, sipping water from a condensation-slick glass and watching the room nod along. I didn't flinch. I'd learned, long ago, how to disappear without going anywhere. But she didn't know what was about to happen. None of them did. I wasn't just the quiet aunt who lived in DC. I was the one who had spent the last 15 years working in international policy strategy, specifically in interagency cooperation on emerging cyber threats to diplomatic infrastructure. I wrote the briefings that shaped how we negotiated with foreign powers. I'd sat in on calls that required multi-level authentication. I drafted documents that were sealed, delivered, and never spoken of again. My name never made the news. That was by design. But there were people who knew my name. People who, if they walked into that room, would cause a chill so sharp it could cut through all the faux warmth and curated toasts. One of them was due to arrive tonight. She was someone Madeline had only ever seen on C-SPAN clips. Someone whose handshake made ambassadors nervous. And when she walked through that door, all of Madeline's staging would unravel. Because you can't rewrite someone out of a story when the ending arrives wearing a government badge and speaks your name into a stunned room. After the toast, the room shifted into that gentle chaos that follows any performance. Servers cleared glasses, someone's bracelet caught on the linen, and guests made their way toward the dessert table, clustering by familiarity and social calculation. No one came toward me. I didn't take it personally. Family systems don't change on a whim, especially ones like ours, where the roles were assigned decades ago and reinforced like wallpaper no one bothers to replace. Madeline was the shining one, the family diplomat. I was the outlier, the career woman whose life was considered interesting only in theory, never in detail. Still, there was something surreal about watching people congratulate my niece for her future while not a single person asked about mine. It reminded me of a phrase I once heard in a briefing: visibility is not the same as recognition. Some people are seen only when the stakes demand it. At the exile table, the cousin with the 3 marriages leaned toward me, eyes slightly glazed with bourbon. "So," he said, "you still doing that government thing?" I gave a polite half-smile. "Yes." "Must be nice," he said, as if I were describing a remote hobby. 9 to 5, benefits, all that. I could have told him that I hadn't worked a true 9 to 5 since 2012. That cybersecurity threat assessments don't obey office hours, and that half my job was explaining to elected officials why a seemingly harmless data breach in one country could destabilize diplomatic negotiations in another. But he wouldn't have understood. This wasn't the room for that kind of conversation. Nearby, I heard one of the bridesmaids ask, "Wait, who's the woman in black? Is she like someone's aunt or whatever?" Another voice answered, "Yeah, but I don't think she does much." Madeline said she's always been a bit off in her own world. I let the words drift past me like smoke. There was a time I would have defended myself. There was also a time I cared. That time had expired somewhere between federal clearances and watching leaders of nations argue over language commas in treaties I helped draft. The irony was almost amusing. The only one in the room with first-hand knowledge of international security was the one they assumed needed small talk, explained slowly. But they didn't know who else was coming. Around 8:15 p.m., my phone vibrated once, a discreet haptic pattern I'd set years ago for a single contact. I glanced down. A single line of text. Arriving in 20. Delay minimal. No name.
No signature.
She never needed to sign. I locked my phone and folded my hands in my lap. The engagement party continued with orchestrated charm. There were speeches from Emilia's fiancé, polished, slightly stiff, and from his mother, who made mention of lineage 3 times and uttered the phrase, "a family with standards," with a kind of saccharine authority that made several relatives nod with vigorous pride. Madeline circulated through the crowd, radiant in a sapphire cocktail dress that photographed well under the warm uplighting. She hugged, she laughed, she squeezed forearms in that performative intimacy that came so naturally to her. The entire evening felt like an audition for a life she already believed she deserved. I watched, quietly. I didn't resent her performance. It was simply who she had chosen to be in the world. Some people build their identities through applause. Others build theirs through actions that are never clapped for. For years, I worked in rooms where applause was considered suspicious. When the plated desserts arrived, lemon tartlets and bruleed custard, Madeline finally approached me. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in her dress before speaking. "Emmy, I didn't see you earlier. I hope you're having a nice time." Her tone was polite in that way people are polite to librarians they don't expect to see again. "It's a lovely event," I replied. She beamed. "Isn't it?" I wanted Emilia to feel truly celebrated. It's important for these milestones to be acknowledged, don't you think? I nodded once. She hesitated, eyes flicking briefly over my shoulder toward the waterfront. "And thank you for coming. I know you're busy. With Washington and everything." She said Washington the way a person might say woodworking or stamp collecting, vaguely respectful, fundamentally uninterested. "I made time," I said. "That's good. Family first, right?" I almost smiled at that, the idea that family ranked anywhere within the first 5 tiers of her priority list. But I didn't correct her. She leaned in, voice lowering. I hope no one made you feel out of place. You know how some people are. I met her eyes. I'm not out of place. She blinked twice, then laughed softly, as if I'd delivered a line she didn't quite understand. Well, then I'm glad. Enjoy dessert. She drifted away, back toward the orbit that had always adored her. The truth was, I didn't come for dessert. I didn't come for the toast. I didn't come for family. I came because the world they assumed I didn't have had spent years intersecting with the world they desperately aspired to join. And tonight, for once, those worlds would collide in the same room. At 8:33 p.m., the doors to the private dining suite opened. There was no announcement.
No fanfare.
Just a quiet shift in the air, like a current cutting through warm water. The woman who walked in wore no formal insignia, but she didn't need it. Her posture alone told the story. Former diplomatic attaché, current Secretary of State for the United States of America. The chatter around the desserts faltered mid-sentence. Phones slowly lowered. Someone dropped a fork. Madeline's eyes widened, stunned, as the secretary scanned the room with calm precision. Then her gaze landed on me. Her expression softened. She walked, not toward the couple, not toward the family offering congratulations, but straight across the room, through clusters of frozen relatives, until she stood directly before me. "Emilia," she said, voice warm but authoritative. "I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to thank you for the briefing package." The revised language in Section 4 was exactly what we needed. Every fork in the room stopped moving. I stood, smoothing my dress. "Of course, Madam Secretary." I was happy to provide it. Then, just as rehearsed in rooms where nothing is ever technically rehearsed, the secretary placed a hand lightly over mine and said, with perfect clarity, "You saved us a dozen months of diplomatic headaches. I meant to say that sooner." Madeline stared. Everyone stared. Emilia froze beside the champagne fountain, her fiancé's mouth slightly open like a man bracing for an unexpected weather event. And for the first time all evening, no one spoke over me. No one redirected attention. No one skipped my name. They simply waited, silently, to understand who I had been all along. The moment after the secretary said my name stretched longer than anyone expected. Not in volume, it wasn't loud, but in weight. The kind of weight that rearranges a room. Madeline's face didn't move at first. I could see her struggling to recalibrate the moment, like a politician caught off script. Emilia stared at the secretary like a stranger had just walked out of her textbooks. The fiancé blinked twice and whispered something to his father, who replied without removing his eyes from me. The secretary, meanwhile, stood easily beside me, utterly comfortable in the sudden attention. She was not a woman given to dramatics. Her words had been intentional, deliberate, and clear. She didn't linger. That was the brilliance of her presence. She said exactly enough. Then she gave a nod, turned toward the event organizer to request a quiet table near the window, and left the rest to interpretation. I returned to my seat without a single glance at my family. I didn't need to. The damage was already done. Not in a cruel way, but in the way that reality does damage to illusions. The version of me that Madeline had spent years offering up in social narratives, the slightly odd, distant sister with a nebulous DC job, had just been erased in one sentence by one of the most powerful women in American diplomacy. The secretary's words were not praise. They were facts. That made them undeniable. Within minutes, the room changed. Conversations thinned. Laughter dimmed. People began glancing toward me, unsure of whether to re-engage or retreat. At the exile table, the cousin with the bourbon was now sitting upright, elbow off the table. He leaned toward me again, this time with a tentative smile. "So, what exactly do you do?" I looked at him. Not cruelly. Just level. "I write things most people aren't allowed to read." He let out a confused laugh, then stopped when he realized I wasn't joking. Further across the room, Madeline had recovered enough to cross her arms and begin whispering to Emilia, whose expression was now marked by something I hadn't seen in her face all evening. Curiosity. She looked at me like someone discovering that the woman who helped her practice multiplication tables had, without her knowledge, helped steer diplomatic protocols for missile de-escalation on another continent. Because I had. I'd joined the National Security Language Initiative right out of undergrad, studying cross-border digital policy and translation protocols. By 27, I was writing threat memos for the Joint Cyber Task Force. I didn't wear uniforms. I didn't take public credit. But I sat behind the scenes while congressional language was negotiated, sometimes between parties, sometimes between nations. I developed frameworks that would later be cited in diplomatic summits. And I ghostwrote position papers that passed through the secretary's hands years before she ever addressed me by name in front of my family. But none of this had ever made it into family newsletters or holiday table discussions. Because I had learned, early and deeply, that in rooms like ours, some truths only mattered when spoken by the right voice. And tonight, the right voice had spoken. A few minutes after the secretary sat, I saw Madeline excuse herself from a group of guests and begin walking toward me. Her movements were careful, curated. The way someone might approach a person they just realized had rank. She stopped a foot away from my chair and gave a tight smile. "Well," she said, "that was surprising." I met her eyes. "Was it?" She tilted her head, a familiar habit when she was searching for the upper hand. "You never said you knew her." The secretary. "You never asked. I thought you worked in, policy admin or something." "I do," I said calmly. "Just not the kind you read about." She bit her lip and laughed softly, as if trying to smooth the moment. "You really kept that close to the chest, didn't you?" I didn't respond. Madeline's tone shifted, subtle but sharp. "You could have said something before the party. Given us a heads up. It caught people off guard." "You mean it caught you off guard?" I said. Her nostrils flared slightly. "It just changed the tone of the evening." I nodded once. "Yes, it did." She hesitated, lips parting, then closing again. "What is it you actually do?" she asked. "I mean, really?" I took a breath, then gave her the shortest truthful answer I could. "I translate silence." She blinked. "What?" "I work in a space where every sentence matters. Where diplomacy isn't about what's said, but what's not. Where one word can start or stop something bigger than both of us." She looked away. The weight of it wasn't hers to carry, and she knew it. But why never mention it? "All these years," she asked. I studied her face, polished, elegant, beautiful in that way socialites often are. "Because you already had a story in your head about who I was." I didn't see the point in correcting it. Until now. Madeline opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Emilia joined her, stepping lightly in heels she was still learning to walk in. She looked between us, then at me. "Aunt Emmy, was that really the Secretary of State?" "Yes." She said you saved a negotiation? Something like that. Her eyes widened. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I never needed you to be proud of me to do the work." Emilia stared at me, the way a child stares when they realize grown-ups have entire worlds they never talked about. Behind her, someone dropped a glass. The noise snapped Madeline out of her silence. She gave a brittle smile. "Well, I guess you got your moment." I tilted my head, soft but firm. "That wasn't a moment. That was a correction." She didn't reply, just nodded, turned away, and walked back into the crowd. Emilia stayed for a few more seconds. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all night. "I always thought you were cool," she said. "But this is next level." I laughed gently. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my cover." She laughed too, then ran back toward her fiancé. I sipped my water slowly, looking out at the room that had built an entire narrative without me, only to find that I'd been building something else entirely. And tomorrow, most of them would still be talking about it. But none of their talk could change what had already happened. The secretary had walked in. She had said my name. And everything had changed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of polite tension. No one quite knew how to recalibrate. The ones who had ignored me earlier suddenly found reasons to drift near my table, a refill, a polite smile, a question veiled as small talk. But the exile table had become something else now. A quiet epicenter. The woman beside me, who had spent the first hour calling me Eleanor, now offered me a napkin with a smudge of chocolate tart and asked, too casually, "So, is it true you work for the White House?" I smiled softly.
No.
"Oh," she said, relief flickering across her face. Until I added, "The White House is downstream of where I work." She didn't ask another question. The secretary didn't stay long. She finished her conversation near the window, declined the offered dessert, and left the way she came. Quietly, efficiently, with 2 aides and a subtle nod in my direction. But the imprint of her presence lingered like the scent of cedar in a library.
Clean.
Distinct. Undeniable. As guests began collecting coats and gift bags, the usual flurry of thank yous and goodbyes circled the room. Only this time, they moved around me, not through me. No one skipped my name again. Madeline stayed toward the center of the room, posture immaculate, voice steady. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the gold clasp of her clutch like she needed something to hold on to. She didn't speak to me again.
She didn't need to.
The silence between us had already been spoken through. Emilia, though, approached once more before leaving. Her heels clicked softly against the marble tile, slower this time, measured. She stood in front of me, uncertain for a moment, then leaned down and hugged me. Not a polite shoulder tap. A real hug. "I don't know everything you do," she said, "but I hope one day I grow up to be a little more like you." I felt my throat catch, but I kept my voice steady. "You'll grow up to be like yourself. Just don't let anyone tell you who that is before you're ready." She pulled back, nodded, and walked off toward her fiancé, her head held a little higher than before. As the room emptied, I remained seated, letting the noise fade into something manageable. One of the staff, a young man no older than 20, came to clear the water pitchers. He glanced at me, then hesitated. "Ma'am," he said, voice cautious, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "That lady, the important one. She knew you." "Yes." He looked down, nervous. "Everyone kind of changed after that." I smiled gently. People often do, when the story they believed isn't the whole story. He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, he asked, "Who are you?" I let the question hang for a moment, then answered the only way that felt true. "I'm someone they didn't expect." He nodded, more solemnly than I expected, and walked away. I left the venue alone. The valet didn't rush. He didn't need to. The evening had already unfolded on its own timeline. As I slid into the car, I looked back once. At the chandeliers, the curated flowers, the place cards that defined a social hierarchy that no longer held. I drove in silence. No music, just the low hum of tires on asphalt, the kind of white noise that lets your mind settle. But I didn't drive home. Instead, I drove past the harbor, past the hotel where out-of-town guests were checking in, past the bridge that splits Charleston from the rest of the world. I stopped at an all-night diner, the kind that hasn't updated its signage since 1987. Inside, a teenage hostess barely looked up. "Anywhere's fine," she said. I sat by the window, ordered black coffee and the same grilled cheese I used to eat at 1 a.m. after long nights writing foreign policy analysis memos with eyes burning from fluorescent light. The diner wasn't fancy. The silverware didn't match. But no one asked why I was alone. No one looked at me like I didn't belong. That was the thing about the places I valued. They didn't need a story before they made space for you. I took a slow sip of coffee and pulled out my phone. There were messages. Not from my sister, but from a few cousins, one uncle, even Emilia's fiancé. Most started the same way. I had no idea. I didn't reply, because they weren't really asking anything. They were just trying to reorient themselves around a truth they hadn't bothered to discover. And I wasn't there to help them do that. Some revelations are meant to echo in silence. I stared out the diner window at the gas station across the street. A man pumped fuel in a suit jacket too expensive for the hour. A teenager walked out with sour candy and a blanket of anxiety. Somewhere, the Secretary of State was boarding a red-eye flight, preparing to brief foreign delegates who didn't even know her favorite breakfast was just toast with raspberry jam.
And me.
I sat with grilled cheese cooling beside a black coffee, knowing I had changed nothing. Except the story they'd been telling without me. That was enough. Soft revenge doesn't always look like slamming doors. Sometimes, it looks like being quietly, irrevocably seen. Not because you demanded it, but because the world shifted, ever so slightly, toward the truth. And stayed there.